Hi everyone, I'm Amy Smart, a designer with Riley Blake Designs. Today I'm going to be sharing a fun project that you can prepare for your summer decor. Perfect for patriotic red, white, and blues. We'll be making two blocks, a star block and a stripes block. These blocks are found, the star block is found in my Fly the Flag quilt pattern. You can see the quilt behind me. This pattern has 6 different 6-inch star blocks. We'll just be focusing on one of them today. It's a fun block using quarter square triangles, and I will be showing you a great shortcut for piecing these blocks. There will also be a link in the video description for a free PDF download that will give you all of the fabric requirements, cutting instructions, piecing to make a 20 by 20 inch pillow using these 2 blocks, or you could use the blocks to make a simple table runner. Lots of options with this one. This pattern is a great one for using your favorite red, white, and blue scraps. Today I will be piecing with my Portsmouth fabric collection that includes lots of shades of reds, corals, blues, and whites. Let's walk through the supplies that you'll need for this project. I'm going to use a 6.5-inch ruler. Will be marking the backs of our blocks, so a pencil and a ruler that's long enough to draw diagonal lines. I have some little fabric snips for trimming threads. I'm going to be using a 3.5-inch ruler for squaring up my blocks, but if you don't have a 3.5-inch ruler, a larger square ruler will work great as long as it has a diagonal line across it, like this one, and a rotary cutter. And I also recommend, I'm going to be talking about cutting long strips for our strip piecing. So you'll need a long ruler, at least, this one is 24 inches long, to be cutting those long width of fabric strips. Okay, let's get started on our blocks. I'm just going to go ahead and move these out of the way. And show you what we'll need. First of all, we're going to work on piecing our star blocks. Here are the fabric requirements that you'll need for one star block. We'll need 5 2.5-inch squares. These will be our corners and center. Now, we need 4 other squares to make these quarter square triangle blocks. And they're going to be large because we're going to be sewing them together, trimming them, and squaring them up so that they look perfect. And for this block, it'll correlate with similar with colors with this one. I need 1 square that's the same colors of my corners and center, 2 squares, 3.5-inch squares, and all of this, like I said, all these notes are in the printable pattern. 2 3.5-inch squares that will be the points for the block, and then 1 contrasting blue that will end up as this interior square, create this interior square in a square look. This, I could also use just the same matching blue and have just the points pop. There's so many options with this, but we'll stick with this for today. All right. The first thing we're going to do is pair up the white squares with the blue squares. So these matching white squares just be paired up, right sides together with the contrasting blue. And here's where I'm going to use that ruler and a pencil to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner on the back of the lighter color fabric. Like this. If you want to pin it, you can. I sometimes just take it right to the machine and start sewing, but I'll stick a pin in just to keep things together for right now. All right, the next step I'm going to take is sewing a diagonal line on both sides of this center drawn line, so a 1/4 inch away on both sides. And let me say one thing really quickly before I start stitching. I do recommend a scant 1/4 inch when piecing these blocks and our stripe blocks as well. It will just help everything come together perfectly. Okay, so here we're going to sew and I'm going to just chain them through, one behind the other. And then you can just flip it around. At this point, we can pull out the pins, so we don't need them anymore. And just so I can point it out really quickly, a scant 1/4 of an inch is going to be just slightly narrower than a 1/4 of an inch with my ruler. It will just be a thread inside a 1/4 of an inch. Okay, at this point, we're going to cut both these blocks right on that drawn line. And then I'm going to take them to my ironing board and press it. Move these out. And in both cases, we want to press our seam allowance toward the darker fabric, so away from the white print that's the star print. And I like to press from the top because I can get a really nice crease and make sure it's all the way open, that seam's all the way open and lying nice and flat. And here's why that matters. Now we're going to take our half square triangle blocks and we're going to match up opposite colors. And so these press seams are really going to make a difference when we put them right sides together. So you can see I'm matching the whites with the blues. And I want to really nest those seams, butt them right up against each other. Actually, do both. And then we're going to draw another diagonal line. This time it's going perpendicular with our seam. And it's okay, at this point we've got lots of room to square up these blocks. The most important thing is really matching up that center, because that's going to give us those perfect points in the center of the 1/4 inch block. So before I pin it, I can feel with my thumbs, yeah, that's nice and flat. They meet up. Now I'll take them back over to my machine and repeat the same process of sewing a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the drawn line. And again, you can chain them through. Just be careful as you come to that intersecting seam to guide that so they stay flat. You don't even need to break your thread. You can just lift the needle and swap them. And sew that other side. All right, bring it back to your cutting mat. Just trim those threads. And we'll repeat the same process, just like we did before. You're going to cut right on that drawn line. And when you open up the block, you have a perfect 1/4 inch block. We do need to square these up. So first I'll show you how I press them and then how I square them up. So first bring them to the machine and I do this, the ironing board, and press it flat from the top. I do that first with all 4 blocks. And I'm just gonna show you one at a time. And then here is a fun little trick when you're piecing these 4 intersecting seams. I like to pop those threads right there. And it creates a little 4 patch right in the middle. This isn't necessary. You don't have to do this. It's just an extra tip for helping that center seam lie flat when you're going to quilt it, so it's not as bulky when you're sewing over with the quilting part, but it makes a nice flat 1/4 inch block. Now we're going to talk about squaring up these 1/4 inch triangle blocks so that they're a perfect 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch square. And I've got a couple methods for doing that. And first of all, I made a boo-boo before. I told you the wrong size ruler for squaring up. I mentioned 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch squares. We're going to use a 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch square. This is a perfect little template from Lori Holt's Cute Cuts collection. And this one works fabulously because it already has diagonal lines marked and the center clearly marked. So I can use that as a template, as a clear guide, just laying it right over the tops of my seams with the center perfectly placed, and square up this quarter square triangle block perfectly. Really easy. So if you have one of these or want to get one of these, that is a great shortcut. Makes it really simple. But let me show you the same process if you don't have a 2.5 inch template. So here's another quarter square triangle block. This time I'm just using a square ruler. To square up a 2.5 inch block, we need to find the center point. That's the most important part of this block because that's what's going to show when we piece the star together. So to find that center, I need to find the middle of a 2.5 inch block is going to be 1.25 inches from all 4 directions. So I'll find that 1.25 inch point right here. See, 1.25, 1.25, where that meets. You can always like put a piece of washi tape or something to help you eyeball that really quickly. But basically I'm going to lay that 1.25 inch point right on top of where those 4 seams intersect. Then rotate my ruler so that this point is lying on this end of the diagonal and the 2.5 inch mark is lying at this other end of that diagonal seam. Hold that steady and square off those sides. When you rotate the block to square the other 2 sides, it doesn't matter because you've already got that 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch side perfectly done. And I can just use that 2.5 inch line to square up my 2.5 inch block. And so here is how those come together. I've got my 5 2.5 inch blocks for the corners and center. And now I've got my 4 2.5 inch quarter square triangle blocks where I've rotated them so that these become the star points and the contrasting blue is in the center. From there, I'll sew these blocks together into 3 rows like this, pressing the seams away from the quarter square triangle block. I've said it too many times. So the seams will go out right here. The seam allowances will be pressed in on this row and then back out on the 3rd row. So that when I go to sew my rows together, those seams will nest. You can see that? Where those seam allowances will nest, helping you get perfect points. And then after sewing these 2 seams, I press those seams toward the top and bottom row. So this is what the back of the block will look like. And where you've spiraled those intersecting quarter seams, they'll lie nice and flat. So it's a lot easier to quilt through this block. And that's how we make block A, the star block. It's a finished 6 inch block. So at this point, it will measure 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches because it has that seam allowance. So now let's talk about piecing the stripe block that will alternate with this star. Let's move these things out of the way. So this is the stripe block that we're going to piece. And I'm going to piece it rather than cutting multiple, which you could do. You could cut 6.5 inch by 1.5 inch strips. Again, all of these measurements will be in that printable PDF that you can find in the link in the show notes. So you don't need to remember this right now. You could cut these individually, but I'm going to cut long strips, sew them together, and then trim my blocks down. So here's how we're going to do that. I've pre-cut some of my strips so I can show you sewing them together, but I want to walk through cutting one strip off of a piece of yardage because this is an important part of strip piecing. You want to make sure that your strip is perfectly straight. You want this to come perfectly straight, not in a kind of a V. So let's talk about that really fast first. So here is my yardage. This is when I'm going to use one of the long rulers. Sometimes when you unfold yardage, you bought it at the fabric store, it's come in order, it might be a little wonky. So I always recommend pressing it, refolding it, lining up the selvage edges. And before you cut long strips, just give it a good press. Make sure that, let's work with this edge that's kind of wonky. So you can give it a good, it might even require repressing that center seam, because the most important thing is having your selvage edges line up. Then, once that's done, I put my sometimes repressed center fold. I can line that up on the straight line on my mat. And I'm right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you'll want to swap this. I like to use the mat and the ruler as my guide for getting a nice square edge on my fabric. So because I've repressed, I know this is straight, and I can just lay another straight line on the ruler right on top of that straight pressed edge and trim a nice clean edge on my yardage. Then I'll flip it over. And because I have a nice square edge, I'll get a perfectly straight strip. So again, line up that fold on that straight line. This time I'm going to cut a 1.5 inch strip. I can just measure over 1.5 inches. I like to do it this way because I like the ruler to cover the piece I'm going to cut. That helps with accuracy. And I can get a lot of pressure with my hand on the ruler so my ruler doesn't slip. And so here I get a perfectly straight 1.5 inch strip. This is especially helpful when the strips are really narrow like these ones. All right, let's move this out of the way. And here I have some strips that are ready to go, ready to sew together. And we'll piece it in the same order that this block's in. So I'm going to start with this stripe and alternate. And while I'm laying these out, let me point something out. I will match up all the selvage edges, and I'll explain why this helps in just a minute. Piecing these together, this is where I also highly recommend a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because we have so many seams in this block, if the seams are just a little too wide, this will be too narrow. So paying attention to your 1/4 inch seam allowance, really focusing on keeping it a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance will help a lot with piecing these blocks. You could pin these strips together if you like. I just put them right sides together and just carefully feed it through. Okay, before I sew any more strips, I want to press this seam first. So first I press it closed to just set that seam. And then I press from the front, opening the darker fabric, so in this case the red, back, and I can just use the tip of my iron to really get inside that seam and make it nice and flat. This is key to having your block end up the right width and to just having crisp stripes. All right, so I mentioned I started by sewing the selvage edges together. Now here's the tip. If I were to just go ahead and sew this strip, I could, if I'm sewing both seams the same direction, my strip set can start to arc. So here is a tip to help with that. When I sew this long strip to the strip set, I'm going to sew from the other direction. So those selvage edges help me keep track of which direction I've started sewing. And this time I'm going to sew from the other end. Matching up these ends isn't that important because we're going to be trimming them off. Okay, we'll repeat the pressing. Again, pressing, set the seam, and then press toward the dark. Okay, and I've already got my other strip set sewn. I do recommend sewing 2 sets of 3 rather than just sewing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It can get a little wonky that way. So if I sew 2 sets of 3, it's going to help keep those strips nice and straight, which is going to be really important when we go to trim down the blocks. So here I've got this set ready. We can just put it right sides together and one more long seam. And here I can also kind of nest my seams. That helps me keep these blocks. I can feed them through the machine, hold them together without having to pin. But if you're more comfortable, definitely go ahead and pin. Okay, once I have my strip set, so I'm going to do one last press. So again, we'll skip the setting the seam this time. I'll just press from the top and open up nice and flat. And I can, as I've got now my 6 together, I'm really going to carefully press that center seam, but at the same time, make sure all of the seams, all 5 seams, are really pulled nice and flat. So now I have my strip set ready to trim. And again, it doesn't matter how this looks because we're just going to trim it off. So in this case, you can use a 6.5 inch by 6.5 inch template ruler again, or just any ruler with a 6.5 inch width, or use your mat, however it's easiest for you. But we're going to cut 6.5 inch by 6.5 inch squares. So this should measure 6.5 inches wide. And again, this is where the scant seam allowance helps. If any of those seams are a little too, if you're not getting a perfect 6.5 inch width, you might just want to check your seam allowances, make them a little skinnier. And now I can go ahead and trim my blocks. And you can see even mine is not quite perfect because I was sewing fast on camera, but it's okay. I'll show you how to work. So we trim that end off, and then again, I flip it around because I like to be able to use the ruler. I'll use this ruler in this time as to make sure I get the width an accurate width. So I'm lining up the end with the end of my blocks, and I'm going to use this ruler to line up the lines on the ruler so that they're directly on the seams. That will help keep my stripes from getting wonky too. But just know when you're sewing this many strip sets together, they will get a little wonky. You probably will need to square up your end again. So here's how I do that. Just pull it. You can see it's just not quite perfect. And that's totally normal. I'll just clean up that edge and then I can keep going. I need 4 of these blocks for my pillow, or more if I'm making a table runner. You can just keep going. But there I have my 6.5 inch stripe block. And let's kind of lay these out and put them together. And those will alternate with the stars block to make a great patriotic pillow or table runner. I could continue. Again, you can find all of the information for making the pillow or the table runner, including fabric requirements, cutting instructions, finishing instructions, in the link in the video description. Thanks so much for joining me. Again, my name's Amy Smart. You can find more of me at my website, www.diaryofaquilter.com, or on Instagram or Facebook at Diary of a Quilter. Thanks.